content over everything.
Lights, camera, action. Okay, so are we good to go? Roll? Good to roll? Yeah. So I want to talk about 9 reasons why I am not a Muslim. 9 reasons why I reject Islam. The first of those reasons is the claim that Islam provides a perfect law. Muslims claim that Sharia law is a divine law, that it is given by God in its fullness and in its completeness, and that law is perfect. However, this actually is not true. What really happens is that Muslim scholars will take some reference or some vague principle in the Quran and then construct how you apply that law to the world. An example of this would be the fact that in the Quran it talks about fasting. It says that you know the times of fasting by when you can tell the difference between black cotton and white cotton at the rising and the setting of the sun. However, what do you do about places like Greenland where there is no rising and setting of the sun? The way that Muslims have adapted their law is to speculate and to make up a principle that you either do it off the nearest country where there's a rising and the setting of the sun, or you can do it off Saudi Arabia, or that you do it off some other timing. But it's not clear from the text of the Quran or from the text of the Hadith that this is what you do. So what they are doing is they are inventing their law. Their scholars are inventing their law, and that's one example on something as fundamental as fasting. It is just the same as a Christian politician taking a Christian principle and applying it to a secular state and saying that because of this Christian principle we are going to apply Christian laws. So this is the first reason why I'm not a Muslim. The claim that Sharia law is a divine law is a lie. It is a falsehood. Sharia law is created by Muslim scholars based upon hadiths that were written later, and the Muslims themselves don't agree. Another reason why I am not a Muslim is because Sharia law does not provide a better society than secular law. Secular law in the West has provided a better economic justice, more social freedom, more social equality than Sharia law. And to prove my point, I say, look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is an area of the world where Islam has dominated unchallenged for 1400 years. And people are not exactly flooding to Saudi Arabia to live. In fact, actually, many Saudi citizens are actually fleeing Saudi Arabia to live outside of an Islamic society because the freedoms and the equalities of a liberal secular society are more preferable to the restrictions of Sharia law. Sharia law doesn't solve the problems it claims to solve. So we're no better for it or without it. And I'm not saying that liberal secular law is perfect, and I'm not saying that liberal secular law is brilliant, because it most certainly isn't. But what I am saying is that this promise of utopia that is given by Sharia law is a lie. It is false. The third reason why I'm not a Muslim is because of textual variance in the Quran. Muslims make the claim that their Quran is unchanged, unedited, and has remained the same for 1400 years, dot for dot, word for word, letter for letter. That is the claim of people like Ahmadiyya. That is the claim of people like Zakir Naik. But the reality is, when you look at different texts of the Quran, you compare the most modern Quran to the oldest Quran, there are textual variants within them. And Muslims have made an argument that textual variance within biblical manuscripts is sufficient reason to doubt the reliability of those biblical manuscripts. Therefore, by using their logic, we can conclude that if there are textual variants in the Quran, that the Quran also cannot be trusted. Furthermore, the criticism about textual variants within the Bible, making the Bible invalid, is not a valid argument, because any genuine understanding of the Christian faith understands that the Christian faith came before the text. The text emerged out of the Christian community. It was written by Christians, it was written for Christians, and Christians are the ones to handle and interpret it. Whereas, by contrast, Islam is a religion based on the book of the Quran. That is what Muhammad started, and the community formed around the book. So therefore, when there are changes to the book, that is a problem. My fourth reason for continuing to be a Christian rather than embracing Islam is the false argument made by Muslims that because our understanding of our faith has evolved in terms of the way that we describe central doctrines like the Trinity, which the language of which was canonized at the Council of Nicaea, because of this development, that therefore our faith was invented. The fact that you can evidence that Christians were worshipping Father, Son and Holy Spirit from the earliest times is totally ignored by Muslim polemicists. And it also ignores the fact that Islam underwent historical change. The hadiths are new, they weren't there at the time of Muhammad. The Islamic schools of law were new, they weren't there at the time of Muhammad. The fact is that Islam has developed. The theology of the Quran being an eternal book was something disputed by early Muslims known as the Mu'tazilites. And it wasn't until that disputation that Muslims came to the conclusion and canonized that conclusion that the Quran was eternal. So in Islam there is historical development, and yet Muslims say that any historical development is evidence that that religion can't be trusted. Furthermore, there is an inherent contradiction within Islam where the Quran says that on this day I have perfected your religion, which means that in the time of Muhammad, the religion of Islam was said to be perfect. If something is perfect, why do you need to add anything to it? And yet we see in historical development, things were added to Islam. Hadiths were added to Islam. Understandings of doctrines developed. These were not normative at the time of Muhammad, they came later. My fifth reason for not being a Muslim and for rejecting Islam is the irreliability of the hadiths. The reality is that despite all their rhetoric, despite all their claims about how isnad and hadith science and matin and the science of hadith guarantees that the hadiths are a reliable corpus of text, the reality is that Muslims themselves have no certainty. Muslims themselves are in disagreement about which hadiths can be trusted and which hadiths cannot be trusted. Shia and Sunni Muslims, whilst both making the same claims about the reliability of hadiths, do not agree about which hadiths can be trusted. They disagree, demonstrating the fact that they have no certainty. We see in the park on a regular basis Muslims chucking their hadiths under the bus. even when you quote a Sahih Bukhari hadith to a Salafi Muslim, they will still chuck that hadith under the bus if they find that hadith too embarrassing, too controversial, or too contradictory to something that they believe. And if Muslims themselves, sorry Yahya, I'm just doing a talk to the camera. I'm just going to have to talk over Yahya because I found myself a heckler. So the reality is that Muslims themselves have no agreement about which hadiths can be trusted, and if they themselves cannot know what hadiths can be trusted, why should any of us trust the corpus of hadith?
Our scale is the Quran.
My
So if any
seventh
hadith
reason,
contradicts the Quran,
reason
if any hadith
for
contradicts the
denying
Quran,
and rejecting,
it mean
don't be
it's
rude,
false.
Yahya.
No, I will be rude.
There we
because
go.
You are
This is the kind of
you are
supremacist
spreading deceptive
ideology.
lies. And I'm
So,
answering you.
I'm not asking for an answer.
No,
I'm
you're not
giving
asking.
my
No,
reasons
your reason,
as to why
your reason,
I reject Islam. My sixth reason for rejecting Islam
Nobody invited
is
to
the
reject
fact
Islam.
that Paul and his Christianity defeated all opposition. The reality is that the Quran makes a promise to the followers of Jesus,
what Paul does,
and that promise
he
that the Quran makes to the followers of Jesus,
obedience
the fact
and
is
to
that
grace.
that promise that was made to the followers of Jesus is that they, the Muslims of the first century, would be made superior over the disbelievers in Jesus and the Islam of his day.
The Islam,
but the reality is,
by and you don't
that
like
the apostolic
somebody to
church
answer you.
was the movement
This is
that
how
won out
deceptive liar
over
you are.
all other opposition.
As a coward,
Paul
like last time you ran away
Peter
from
and James
debating.
and Thomas and Thaddeus and all the apostles were victorious. And so the promise made by the Quran was proven false, because the Quran made a promise that the Muslim followers of Jesus would be superior, and they were not. They are not anywhere in history. No one even knows about them. No one talks about them. No one argues with them. No one disputes with them. There isn't a shred of evidence that they ever existed. And that is a historical fact. They did not exist. The Quran made a false promise and put it in the words of Allah, and that false promise is not true.
Let me give you the differences in each of your gospel,
because
to see
my
how
eighth
deceptive
reason
and lies you are.
is because I didn't
Your
invite
Christianity.
Yahya to a debate.
You're talking
He's
about
just
Islam.
forcing his way into a conversation that I am having with the camera.
No, heaven with the camera, but don't lie about Islam.
My eighth reason for rejecting Islam is that supposedly a perfect man, a great prophet called Muhammad, established a perfect system called Sharia law, and in that Sharia law there was a caliph, a system of law, a political system that was perfect, that was from God. And that prophet was succeeded by rightly guided caliphs in a perfect system. Thank you. And that perfect system died. Where is it? Where is the caliphate now? The caliphate is dead and buried. It was a socio-political economic experiment that failed in history.
Would you allow me to answer?
Why did it fail?
Would you allow me to answer?
After I finish.
You will never finish.
After I finish.
Because there's too many points.
After I finish, Mr. Bean. Your patience, please.
Is that
the reason why
you know my name
the
is
caliphate
Yahya.
failed is because it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't perfect because it wasn't from God, and it wasn't from God because Muhammad wasn't a perfect man and he didn't establish a perfect system. By contrast, we Christians believe that the Ecclesia, the church, was founded by Jesus Christ on his apostles. And you can find the church today in every country of the earth. And you can find the church today even in Saudi Arabia, where you can't even find the caliphate. So the very place where Muhammad established his so-called perfect system, his socio-economic political reality, and where Islam has remained unchallenged for 1400 years, you can't even find the failed Islamic caliphate. But you can find secret Christian believers in Medina, Riyadh and Mecca. The underground church is alive in Saudi Arabia, where the caliphate is dead. And so we don't need Islam, we don't need a caliphate. What we need is Christ's church. My final reason, and then Mr. Bean can respond. My final reason for rejecting Islam is Muhammad himself. Now, many Muslims who can hear my voice believe that the last example of a genuine Islamic caliphate was the Ottoman Empire. So let me look at the Ottoman Empire and know them by their fruits. The Ottoman Empire invaded lands that were not their own. The Ottoman Empire persecuted Christians and Jews. The Ottoman Empire kidnapped and enslaved Christians by the millions. The Ottoman Empire indoctrinated children as child soldiers and sent them back to kill their own mothers and fathers and to rape their own sisters and cousins. The Ottoman Empire had a slave trade. The Ottoman Empire desecrated churches. The Ottoman Empire stole land and property and riches that were not their own. We have another movement in recent times that has done all of these things. The name of that movement is ISIS. ISIS have invaded lands that were not their own. ISIS have kidnapped Christian children. ISIS have reintroduced slavery. ISIS have raped women. ISIS has desecrated churches. ISIS has confiscated property, lands and riches that were not their own. Now, how is it that a group like ISIS, that Muslims condemn as an aberration of Islam, have done exactly the same as the Ottoman Empire that many Muslims would say is an example of Islam? Why? Because of Muhammad. Muhammad invaded lands that were not his own. Muhammad stole property that was not his own. Muhammad allowed his followers to rape women. Muhammad sold slaves. Muhammad had slaves. Muhammad persecuted religious minorities. Muhammad excluded religious groups. My final reason for rejecting Islam is Muhammad himself. And by contrast, as a Christian, I look to my Lord Jesus Christ. And what do I see? I see a man who, in a time when women were considered as second class, spoke to women with dignity. I see a man who, in a time when slavery was normative and normal, never had a slave. I see a man who, when religious and ethnic prejudice was normal to the Jewish people about the dirty Gentile, or in Muslim speak, the dirty kuffar, he embraced people from every race. I see a man in Jesus who embodied love and hope and faith, who embodied chastity and self-control, patience. He embodied prudence and wisdom. When we look at Christianity and Islam, we see the church founded by Jesus Christ is still here, and the caliphate founded by Muhammad is already in the history books and dead. We see that Christians fought against slavery for 2,000 years, and Muslims kept slavery going for 1,400 years.
Haven't I told you you're not gonna finish?
We see.
Haven't I told you you're not gonna finish?
I'm going to finish now. We see in Christian lands, we see that Christians have embodied charities and institutions to which the world now benefits, whereas Christians in the Muslim world, every single Muslim society in the entire world, are suffering discrimination and persecution, and have done so for 1,400 years. Now, since you wanted to reply so much, you can reply.
Bob, I just want to tell you, what you say about Ottomans and ISIS is correct, but they're not representing Islam.
So the Ottomans don't represent Islam. Do the Ottomans represent Islam? To an extent, yes.
Yeah. But at the same way, the Byzantines also represent Christianity. And everything that you said about Islam and everything you said about Jesus, I can find with the Prophet Muhammad. I can find in Islam also. So
Okay, let's do a quick test of that claim.
What you've done right now was very carefully, selectively looked at history. You pointed out what you did like. But then at the same time, you know, history is extremely complex. It's not one-dimensional. You, for example, claimed, you did say that Christianity, you said that the Christians fought against slavery for 2,000 years.
Yep.
You know what, I agree with you to an extent. But then also, if you look in history, you find that the Slavic people in East Europe were enslaved by the Romans who freshly converted to Christianity.
Yep.
So you find this in history throughout.
So now let me return to that point, because you said I was very selective. So let's be very specific. Did Muhammad own slaves?
Yes, he did.
Did Muhammad permit his followers to sell slaves?
Yes.
Did Jesus?
No.
So there's a difference.
Okay. Why?
So now, hold on 1 second.
Okay.
If I follow the example of Jesus, and you follow the example of Muhammad,
Yeah.
which one of us can own another human being as a property?
Well, I wouldn't want to.
No, that wasn't my question.
Yeah.
I said according to our religion, which one of us can?
I can.
There you go. That's the
hold
difference.
on. When I say I can, there's a clause to it. And the clause is that if I live in a society where it's normative, you were speaking of something that was normative during the time of Jesus being alive.
Yes.
And that slave owning was
Normative.
the rule of the day.
And he
Now-
didn't. But
now-
did Muhammad?
Now.
But did Muhammad?
I already explained to you that he did.
Yes,
right?
thank you.
But
So then let's drill down into this. Let's drill down into this. Because you've just said that according to Islam, you can own another human being as a piece of property. That's what you said.
well,
And it's on camera. Right, 1 second.
no, hold
Are
on,
you
hold on,
proud
hold on,
of
hold on,
that?
hold on.
No, I want to ask you.
No, hold on.
Are
Let
you
me tell-
proud?
let me tell you something.
Are you
Let me
proud
tell
of
you
it?
something. Let me tell you something. I live in a world, okay, as a Muslim, I live in the West. I live in a place where owning a slave is illegal. Okay.
Because of whose influence? Islam or Christianity?
Well, it was not just Christianity.
No, that's not.
It's not just Christianity. It was an amalgamation of many
Is
things.
the slave trade still
The
happening in the
slave
Muslim
trade-
world?
from a historical point of view, first of all,
Is it still happening in the Muslim
I
world?
will answer, but let's have a discussion.
Let's time it. Shall we do 3 minutes? 3 minutes? Yeah, because
But I would love to have a
I was supposed to
versus
answer.
a debate, because I think we would gain more benefit.
yeah,
from
let's.
I was
you
supposed
can
to
join-
answer.
You can all join in.
The brother he just come in.
You will benefit a lot because
So, let's time.
everything that you said, there's truth in it.
One second. We're going to do 3 minutes.
I
3
don't
minutes.
have time.
He's going to have 3 minutes. I'm going to have 3 minutes. Once the 3 minutes are in, you just shout time. You stop. So you have the first time.
Content over everything. From Yahya
Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
No, don't interrupt.
Listen.
Man, don't
Bro, don't interrupt.
Man, don't listen to ITV. I don't even listen to
Muhammad
I just listen
had
to
people that were
Man, don't
set
listen to
free
BBC.
and he
Man, don't
put
listen
them
to
back
ITV.
into slavery.
I don't even listen
That's
to
your example.
Man, don't listen to
This is what Muhammad did. Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 4, book 14.